All right, so lecture 9 is going to go over the respiratory system. This is chapter 22 from your textbook, and it's going to cover sections 4, 6, and 7. The main functions of the respiratory system are to supply the body with oxygen for cellular respiration and also to get rid of carbon dioxide. The respiration and the circulatory system are closely coupled because the circulatory system is the one that carries the gases to the tissues when it delivers the oxygen to the tissues, or it carries the carbon dioxide from the tissues to be expelled through the lungs. And it also functions in olfaction and speech. Respiration involves four processes. So in the respiratory system, there's pulmonary ventilation, which is it's breathing. And this is the movement of air into the lungs and out of the lungs. Then there's external respiration, which is the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the lungs and the blood. And then there's a circulatory system, which transports the oxygen and carbon dioxide in the blood. The internal respiration is the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the blood vessels or the systemic blood vessels and tissue. So here are the different processes that are involved in respiration. So starting up here, this is where the breathing occurs. So that's when the air enters the body through through the nose or the mouth and then into the windpipe, which is the trachea. And then the trachea bifurcates into two tubes that are called the bronchi. These are the primary bronchi, and those continue to divide and then into the lungs. Inspiration is when the air moves into the lungs from the atmosphere. Expiration is when the air moves out of the lungs and then back into the atmosphere. External respiration, it's called external because the air is coming from the external environment. So even though it's happening inside the body, that air is coming from the external environment. And there's the exchange that occurs at the capillary beds that are associated with little tiny structures that are called alveoli. So that's where the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide occurs at these capillary beds in the lungs. Then there's the transport of respiratory gases. So that's where the cardiovascular system transports gases using the blood as the transporting mechanism. And then internal respiration is where the exchange happens in capillary beds between the blood vessels and the tissues. Well, we can't really see the tissues, but it's in your PowerPoint. So here are the alveoli, these tiny little structures that are located inside of the lungs. So these are little, yeah, they're like little sacs of structures. They're made up of simple squamous epithelial cells, so they're very thin, and this helps it helps the alveoli in gas exchange. So whenever you see a structure or a tissue that's simple squamous or anything simple, only has one layer of cells, that means that it's most likely the main function of that tissue is to absorb or secrete because it has to allow for molecules to move across. So the alveolar wall consists of a single layer of squamous epithelial cells that are made up of type 1 alveoli. So that's the vast majority of the alveolar sacs. They are made up of the type 1 alveolar cell. And then there's the scattered cuboidal, which are not as common. And these are um, type 2 alveoli. So if I move this slightly down, so you can see these are the type 2 alveoli. The rest of them are a type 1 alveoli, or most of them are type 1 alveoli. But the type 2 alveoli are the ones that secrete a substance that's called surfactant, and also antimicrobial proteins. The surfactant is there to reduce the surface tension of the water that's in the surrounding the alveoli, and it prevents it from collapsing on itself. Pulmonary ventilation consists of two phases. So there's inspiration, which is where gases flow into the lungs. Expiration, obviously the gases exit the lungs, so that's when you're breathing out. In the thoracic cavity, there are specific pressure relationships that are taking place that allow for the lungs to remain inflated. So there's an intrapulmonary pressure, which is the pressure inside of the alveoli or in the alveoli inside of the lung. This pressure becomes equal to the atmospheric pressure. So the atmospheric pressure is going to be at 760 millimeters of mercury, and the intrapulmonary pressure becomes equal to that. That's why there's a zero here to indicate that there's no difference. Then there's the intrapleural pressure, which is lower than the atmospheric pressure. So it's going to be 4 millimeters of mercury less than the atmosphere. So it's going to be at 756 millimeters of mercury. So these differences in pressure is what help the lungs stay inflated. This intrapleural pressure has to be less for the lungs to be inflated. If this is greater than the intrapulmonary pressure, then the lung is going to collapse. Other things that can contribute to this is that if the intrapulmonary intrapleural pressure is equal to the pulmonary pressure, so if it's the same, it'll collapse, or if the intrapleural pressure is equal to the atmospheric pressure, it'll also collapse. So it has to be kept, the intrapleural pressure has to be kept negative to maintain um, the lungs inflated. So things that could change that pressure, okay, would be like if the lungs are punctured by something, or if they rupture, um, like the visceral pleura ruptures. So this is the membrane that surrounds the lungs directly, because there's also the parietal pleura, which is surrounding the it's lining the cavity itself. But if either of these happen, then the intrapleural pressure is going to become equal to the intrapulmonary pressure, and so that's going to cause the lungs to collapse. So during inspiration and expiration, there's going to be a change in volume in the thoracic cavity, and that change in volume is going to affect the pressure within the cavity. During inspiration, there's going to be muscles that contract. So muscles like the diaphragm, when it contracts, it's going to flatten out, so it's going to descend, and the rib cage is going to rise because there's these muscles that are called the external intercostals. So when those muscles contract, they elevate the rib cage. So when that happens, there's the rib cage elevating and also the diaphragm flattening. That's increasing the volume within the thoracic cavity. So the volume increases, and because the volume is increasing, then the pressure is decreasing within the cavity. So the pressure decreases by 1 millimeter of mercury. And because the gases move down the pressure gradients, the the air or gases, the oxygen that's coming in, has a higher pressure outside of the body than inside or inside the thoracic cavity. So it's going to move down the pressure gradient. It's going to move into the lungs. When the inspiratory muscles relax, so that's when the diaphragm goes back to its dome-shaped position. Because when it contracts, it flattens out, but when it relaxes again, it's going to go back to the dome-shaped position. And also, the rib cage is going to descend because of the recoil of the costal cartilages, which are here. So when that happens, there's going to be less space inside of the thoracic cavity. So the less space there is, the greater the pressure. So the pressure in the thoracic cavity um, is going to increase. And when it increases, that means that the pressure inside of the thoracic cavity is going to be greater than the outside. So the air is going to move down its pressure gradient, so going from the inside of the body to the outside. Air is a mixture of gases. So in air, there's nitrogen, oxygen, carbon dioxide, and all these gases are going to move down their pressure gradients. And then there's another property of gases is that they're they have a specific partial pressure. The partial pressure is exerted by each gas in a mixture, and it's directly proportional to the percentage in the mixture. So for example, nitrogen makes up 78% of air, or 78% of the gases in air. And so to get the partial pressure of nitrogen, you multiply the percentage, which would be, if you turn the percentage into a decimal, it would be 0.786 times 760. So that gives you a partial pressure of 597. Okay, so that's why it's proportional to its percentage in the mixture. So there are certain pulmonary diseases that drastically reduce alveolar surface area. So when it reduces the surface area, that makes it less efficient in the diffusion of gases. And this occurs in situations where there are diseases like emphysema. So emphysema is where you have damaged alveolar sacs. And so here the walls of the adjacent alveoli break down and the alveolar chambers enlarge. So there's less of a surface area for gases to diffuse. Other ways that the alveolar sacs get damaged could be due to tumors, mucus, or inflammatory material that can reduce the surface area by blocking the gas flow into the alveoli. So during external and internal respiration, you can see how the partial pressure of gases affects um, how they move down their pressure gradients. So here at the point where the air meets the alveoli in the lungs, you can see that the partial pressure of oxygen is higher in the air that's being inspired than the partial pressure of oxygen at the alveoli in the lungs. So here, the air in the inspired air is going to be at a higher pressure. So it's going to, when it moves down the pressure gradient, it's going to move into the alveoli. But the opposite is true for carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is going to be at a higher pressure in the alveoli, and it's going to be at a lower pressure in the air. So when it moves down the pressure gradient, it'll move out of the lungs. In internal respiration, it's the same thing. It's the gases are going to move down their pressure gradients. So here, where the blood is leaving the lungs and entering the capillaries, the partial pressure here of oxygen is 100 millimeters of mercury, and the blood that's leaving the tissues and entering the lungs has a partial pressure of oxygen at 40 millimeters of mercury. So the pressure is greater um, in the blood that's leaving the lungs and entering the tissue. So that means that the oxygen is going to go from the blood into the tissues because the pressure is higher in the blood than in the tissues. And then again, the opposite is true for carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is going to be at a lower pressure or a lower partial pressure in the blood than it is in the tissues. So when it moves down the pressure gradient, it'll move from the tissues to the blood. Okay, so I'm going to break this video into two parts. So I'll continue on the next part.